I'm William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and in this video we're going to begin the study of the first part of Chapter 1 in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy's Ancient History course. The study of history is a real challenge because obviously we live 6,000 years deep into human history in the truest sense of the word. 6,000 years of non-stop activity all throughout the world. And when we consider that, we consider the study of history, we can expect that it's going to be a very difficult study because there's a lot to learn. There's a lot of reading required because there's a lot of history to study. And the further we get into the future, the more and more challenging the study of history will become. So the best way to go about the study of history is to take a reliable source. And here in our history courses in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, we study the Cambridge Ancient Histories, or the Cambridge Histories for all the periods, and to simply work through them one piece at a time from beginning to end, giving ourselves time and making this something of a pastime, something that we pursue as a good use of our leisure instead of other things like watching sports or playing games and things like that. So surely the study of history takes a great deal of time, but it's a good use of time. We have a good source to go with, and we simply need to work little by little, bit by bit, over a long time, and we'll be able to get a great deal of historical studies done. So in this first video, we're going to walk through the first part of Chapter 1 in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy's Ancient History course. The title of Chapter 1 is Primitive Man, and this first section is titled The Setting of the Stage. The setting of the stage. I'm going to take a little bit of extra time in these first lessons to make sure these important concepts are clear before we get into the study of the history. So, part 1 of Chapter 1, Setting of the Stage. History, in its common and more popular sense, is the study of man's dealings with other men, and the adjustment of working relations between human groups. But there is a larger sense in which human history merges in natural history and studies the dealings of man with nature. And it may be observed that it has been only by slow degrees that any human group has attained to such vision of the unity of mankind, or of civilization, as might constrain it to regard other human groups as more than a peculiarly intractable element in its own natural surroundings. An austere conception of war, that under certain circumstances, right has no court of appeal but might, survives to remind us that man has not yet wholly rid himself of this confusion between things and alien persons. And the most modern conception of international right so far accepts this fact of an alienation between the higher functions of human groups, however reasonable, as to take differences of language, of the medium, that is, for interchange and reconciliation of ideas as the best guide when and where, for the present, it is safer to keep human groups apart and let them manage their affairs as far as possible, each in their own way. So in that first paragraph, The author introduces us to the study of history and begins by working to establish what exactly history is, because the term history is used in a number of different senses. And so before we get into the study of history, we're going to need to establish what exactly we mean by this idea of history. And he also comments on the reality. This book was published in the early to mid 1900s. He comments on the presence of war, especially as we consider the world wars at that time. The concept of war and the concept of nationalism, the division of people by nationalities, by languages and cultures, gets in the way and prevents us from considering the history of human beings, the history of man on earth, because we're often so caught up in our own agendas in terms of promoting our own nation or promoting our own government or military interests and things like that. It's difficult to separate the true study of human history from localized, nationalized, prejudiced ideas of history that actually keep us from learning this truth. So the first question we want to answer is, what exactly is history? And the author is going to continue this discussion in the next paragraph. He says, history, in the narrowest sense of all, as the interpretation of written evidence for arrangements made for right living within a human group or between such groups, accepts implicitly the same criterion and stops short where such evidence is not available. Linguistic paleontology goes a little further back in the study of the distribution of intercommunicant groups and of such relations between them as loanwords or structural likenesses in the speech may suggest. But the spoken word does not fall to the ground like the spent missile or the broken vessel, to be its own memorial of human achievement. The spoken word vanishes in air, so that the philologist deals not with the originals, but at best with the reminiscence of an echo. To recover, therefore, what men were doing or making, still more what they were thinking or desiring before the dawn of history, the sole available method is that of the archaeologist, merging as it does with that of the geologist, since these alone handle and interpret original creations of men's thought and will, and contemporary elements of the physical surroundings of those men. Where the tree falls, there shall it lie. And where the lost implement, or shattered potsherd, or worn-out man fell, there have they lain, for all that anyone cared then or knows now. It is the carelessness, in the literal sense, of the river as to the gravel which it carried, and an equal carelessness of those men as to what happened to their leavings, that justify such a hypothesis of the credibility of these data, and make prehistoric times, at least, a penumbra of history. In the second paragraph, the author points out that if we were to take the narrowest sense, and I would argue the truest sense, of the meaning of the term history, it would refer to what we have in the records actually left by men of their dealings with other men, the written records of human history. He refers to this as the narrowest sense of history, but I would refer to this as the truest and most certain sense of human history. And he argues that since our knowledge of history is limited to only what man happened to write about, relying on written history is not sufficient for us, and we need to go further. And he explains that we can go further by archaeology, by digging up remains of ancient civilizations, and by geology, studying the earth itself. Because if the earth changes, then human behavior would have to change to go along in agreement with what was going on earth. And so the author argues that relying on written human history is not sufficient, but we can go further to look at archaeology and geology. Now, this is the common modern view of history and the study of history. When I say that we're 6,000 years deep into history, I'm using the term history in this narrowest sense. We have no record of human activity, at least in writing, before 4000 BC, really before 3500 BC. Anything beyond that is speculation. It may be based on an interpretation of something found by an archaeologist, but the interpretation itself is debatable, certainly not reliable, not demonstrative in any way. And so we have the narrowest sense of history, which I would refer to simply as history. And then we have attempts by men through different means to try and reconstruct what can be known beyond what can be known by what man himself has written. It's important to note that he refers to the history based on writing as history, and then he refers to the efforts of archaeologists and geologists to go beyond that and speak of time before and outside human writing and human records. He refers to that as prehistory. So we have history, which takes us back no further than 4000 BC. And then we have to accept this idea of prehistory. Okay? And in this study, I as a historian and classicist and as a Christian, I don't accept the testimony of the scientists with regard to prehistory. I don't deny it, because there's no way to either affirm or deny anything that they say. None of it is demonstrative. None of it is certain. And there's no way for us to demonstrate either for or against their theories or ideas about what took place on Earth before human records begin to appear. It's an interesting study, and I think we should go through it so that we understand what modern historians are thinking and saying. But it's an uncertain study, and therefore it doesn't belong or pertain to the science of human history. Okay, so make sure you make this distinction in your studies between history, which is based on actual human testimony of what took place and what has happened through human experience, and prehistory, which is an attempt to reconstruct a knowledge of human history based on evidence found by archaeologists and theories of geologists. Okay, let's continue our reading. Nor are we compelled any longer by prejudice or authority to regard those times as catastrophically short, any more than we must believe that Rome was built in a day. And what he's saying here is that once we accept this idea of prehistory and rely on the work of the archaeologist and the geologist, we can abandon traditional authoritative teaching on world history, which limits us to these years. If you look in Catholic records, for example, you'll see that the Catholic Church, all through its history, through to the 1900s, when this sort of prehistoric theory began to become popular, the Catholic Church taught very clearly, very explicitly, that the creation of the world took place around 4000 BC. Some sources go back into the 5000s BC, but that was it. That was Catholic teaching on the history of the world. And you can see this author is objecting to that. He says, we are not compelled any longer by prejudice, that is, of nationalities trying to force their own history on others, or by authority, that is, church authority, to regard those times as catastrophically short. He goes on to say, man's prehistory merges in the pageant of the animal world. Therefore, if we want to learn more about man, we can simply study the history of animals and what can be learned of animals. And of the planet-wide arena on which it has been in progress. Mountain and sea basin also have their history. Not just man, but the mountains and the seas also have a history of their own. Their geographical distribution has varied in memorial years. And pay attention, read this critically. That's an assertion which is given to us, which is the question itself. We're not sure. How can we say that the geographical distribution of mountains and sea basins has varied? We, the students, reading this book, seeking to study history, we have no knowledge of any such history. And we need to read critically and realize when the author here makes an assertion with no evidence, we are not going to just grant concession and accept that assertion. We're going to wait for the evidence. The geographical distribution of mountains and sea basins has varied in memorial years. We have no evidence of that. So he may propose that as his opinion, but as far as us studying history scientifically, looking for evidence before we affirm anything, we'd like to see proof of this before we accept it as anything more than a theory. Okay, so watch out for assertions made with no evidence. The faith that can remove mountains is the same in kind as that in which the historian brings together armies and frontiers. In other words, this is a kind of faith which is inappropriate for any scientific study. Bone to his bone, showing all the kingdoms of the world in a moment of time. Such historical geography and historical ethnology are a proper prelude to the history of the ancient world. And much, even within that history, cannot be fully understood without them. Ancient peoples come upon the stage of history not all together, but in a certain order, and by their proper entrances, each with a character and makeup congruous with the part they will play. The pageant, or is it the drama, of history presupposes the formation of that character and its equipment in the green room of a remoter past, and the sketch of the growth of initial cultures, which follows now, is intended, like the hypothesis of a Greek play, to describe how men came by those qualities of build and temperament, those aims in life, and the means wherewith they were attempting to achieve them. For to the student of prehistory, a culture is nothing more or less than this: the total equipment with which each generation of men starts on its career, in whatever external conditions. To the archaeologist, no less, it is literally that equipment which the men of each generation were discarding when they and it respectively ceased to be of significant use. In this paragraph, again, we see a number of assertions that do not yet come with any evidence. This is the talk of theory, and theory is fine as long as it is kept and acknowledged to be theory. But what we have here is this plan to introduce world history by first establishing a theoretical prehistory, which is then going to be used to interpret what happens afterwards. And we're not going to accept this theory of prehistory because we're not going to see any evidence that it's necessarily true. He says, the history presupposes, the history of the prehistoric world. This history presupposes the formation of the character and the equipment. In other words, when we pick up with our study of actual written world history, it seems that there's a lot of things already in motion, of people already established on the scene. And that can lead us to then assume that there may have been a long history before that written history started. Again, that's an assumption, that's a theory. But prehistory is an attempt of modern historians to sort of create the first however many thousands or millions or billions of years of history took place before the first men and events we read of in written history. Of course, we have no obligation to accept this theory unless it's demonstrated to us. And as I said, we won't see it demonstrated, but it's helpful for us to study and be familiar with because this is common among modern historians. To continue, the author says, to see how the stage itself was set for this pageant, we must look back beyond the moment when the first characters enter it. For it has been nature, rather than man, hitherto, in almost every scene, that has determined where the action shall lie. Only at a comparatively late phase of that action does man, in some measure, shift the scenery for himself. So here the author assumes some great ancient past of the earth and the natural world, that it existed for who knows how many years before man arrives on the scene, at least as man is recorded to arrive on the scene through written human history. And therefore, because the history of man relative to this history of nature is going to be very, very short and brief, this study of the world before man, this study of natural history, is even more important and more influential than the history of man himself. And so we see here this effort to take written human history and sort of set it aside as not being that important, so we can establish a natural history that's the theory of scientists, of archaeologists and geologists, and use this instead of the written history to actually tell the story of what man is, where man came from, what man's purpose is, what's the current state of affairs in the world, and so on. And again, we're not obliged to accept this theory, and we're not going to see any evidence for it. And we're going to stick with the testimony, the written testimony of man concerning his own history. By nature and man are here meant neither supernatural force nor superhuman design. In other words, this is going to be an entirely materialistic scientific study, supposedly. It's going to be based entirely on the observation of our senses, what can be observed materially. There's going to be no consideration for supernatural forces or any supernatural design. at least the author is honest in telling us his intention. This is an atheistical, materialistic approach to history, at least the study of prehistory. And that's why, as I said, in the end, we're not going to be interested in this prehistory, but it's important for us to study it, to understand the arguments and ideas so that we can refute them. By nature and man are here meant neither supernatural force nor superhuman design altering the arrangement of us and our surroundings like chessmen on a board. Nature, adopted in our speech from the Latin word natura, an unlucky mistranslation of the Greek word physis, stands as a common and inclusive term for all physical events that happen. In Greek, its Greek original, being a verbal substantive signifying the fact of growth, the way things grow. The mere processes of a world as apprehended by a mind. Now he's referring back to Greek writings on nature and the use of this word. Realize that Aristotle was the teacher of ancient Greek physics, and he simply meant, when he spoke of physics, he meant material things that are in motion. So that's very simple to understand. Growing in the sense that they're changing, and changing was the basic idea of motion in Aristotle's philosophy. It has nothing to do, as its Latin antecedents might suggest, with birth or any sort of coming into being, nor with any question, what shall it be in the end thereof? These are matters outside natural history and outside human history alike. In other words, we're not going to give any attention to questions of origins or purposes or divine intentions in the study of history. These are matters outside natural history and human history alike. All history is the mere study of processes, of the way things grow, in the old Greek sense. For to this modern thought has laboriously but unequivocally reverted. After long preoccupation with beginnings and endings, that is, with questions of the origin and the purpose or the end of the world, end of human life, with cosmogony and eschatology of all kinds in the centuries between Greek science and our own. That is the entire history of the Christian world. The Christian world has been concerned with questions of origin and purpose and end, which is reasonable and obviously important, as Aristotle explains in the Ethics. But this modern study of history is going to be concerned with only that which is natural, in the sense that it's material and observable and capable of being studied by means of human senses. This is just modern materialism. Within this nature, so presented as a process or coherent sequence of occurrences, and so far as we know, a part of this nature stands man. So man is just, in this book, seen, or in prehistory, man is simply a part of nature. A part of this nature stands man, perceiving what goes on, learning what that is, conceiving it as alterable by inventive effort, and striving accordingly with experience of what we call results, great or small, of that strife. By man, then, in what follows is meant, notice he's defining man here, by man, in what follows is meant the collective total of such perceiving, learning, inventing, striving, and experiencing selves, myself and yours and theirs. That's what we mean by man, by human experience. By races of men are meant groups and sequences of such selves, linked by corporeal similarities, propagated by natural process within each group, by peoples or selves exhibiting peculiarities of interpretation, invention, and effort, sufficiently similar for their results to be cumulative and coherent, and lastly by cultures or civilizations, the accumulated and coherent results of such similarities in the activity of selves like you and me. So here we have the end of this first part of the first chapter, and we can see clearly what the author's intention is. It's to move away from classical ideas of human history based on human records of their own experiences, and it's the replacement of that human record of history with a new, we can call it falsely, but we can call it a new scientific or experimental history, not only of human history, but of the history of the world itself, as if that knowledge is even possible to be obtained. The author here, and the reason why I'd like to spend time on this, these beginning lessons, is because we can clearly understand how quote-unquote modern thought approaches the study of history, how it has something of a disdain for actual written human history, as if all men are liars and only the scientist can know the truth. It despises all human records and relies only on its own observation, but more importantly, on its own interpretation of what it observes. And this is simply the spirit of the modern scientific age. It's what Francis Bacon wrote about in his work Novum Organum. It was his desire and the desire of those involved in the scientific revolution to take all of the established knowledge that was established by all available means, by human experience, by divine inspiration, by church authority, and so on, to take all of that knowledge that had been accumulated through those sources and to take it and set it all aside as doubtful, and then start, as it were, a brand new examination of the world, to reconstruct or recreate knowledge of human history. And by that experimentation, by that, in archaeology, excavation, digging things up, observing things, interpreting what is found, proposing theories to explain the things that are found, the modern man gives that interpretation more credibility than the written record of all of those past civilizations. And that's up to you to decide whether that's reasonable or not. To think that all of the records of divine revelation are untrustworthy. To think that all of the records of men who lived in ancient times are untrustworthy. To think that all the knowledge gained through the centuries by men who lived by faith, because they lived by faith, labeling all of their knowledge as uncertain, starting from scratch and now leaving the world in the hands of some explorers and scientists and theorists to tell us what actually happened. This is the dream of modern scholarship and modern learning. But I want you to see how explicitly and honestly the author was in taking what is known through human writing, what has been established by human authority, and setting it all aside and starting fresh with archaeologists and geologists and letting them tell us what happened, not only in human history, but even before records of human history can be found. Now, I obviously do not accept this philosophy, this modern scientific philosophy, what we can call inductive philosophy, this idea that the truth can only be known through experimentation and through scientific observation. To make all of our knowledge based on the senses turns us into mere animals and turns the universe into something that developed by chance, that has no God, no spiritual, no supernatural influences or design, all of which is assumed by this author. I'm not willing to grant any of that, but it asks me to accept this idea of a godless, spiritless, soulless, material world, and then says, hey, let's think of the world as if none of these spiritual realities or supernatural influences exists, and let's create our own history of the world and call that the true history of man and of nature. To view man as a part of nature, just a part of nature, rather than the greatest of all creatures and the end of all of the creatures. Man, given by God sovereignty over all creation, set as head and ruler over nature, to reduce him to a mere part of nature, so that we can be free to ignore what he has to say and rely on our own opinions, interpretations, and theories to look at the natural world and create our own story of what took place in the past. It's obvious why men would be interested in doing this. This, of course, is related to the philosophy from where evolutionary theory comes from, which at this time in history is spreading through academic circles. And as I said, we don't have to accept these theories or principles. We don't have to accept this idea of prehistory, but it is very important for us to read an explanation of where this idea comes from, what principles and methods this idea is based on, and how it affects our understanding of world history, so that when we interact with people who embrace this, and I would argue who embrace it uncritically, with no evidence, no demonstrative evidence, but who embrace it as an act of faith, as the author himself admitted, as an act of faith instead of a different faith. When modern men do this and deny that they do any such thing, they claim that they're just simply following the quote-unquote facts or the evidence, and we see that that's not actually true, that there is no evidence, there are no facts, that our interpretation is what determines what the facts are, and then we call that fact and use it as the reason why we disprove or reject something else. That's just a circular argument. We're the sources then of the truth. And then we approve of our own ideas by appealing to our interpretations. So we'll find that this notion of prehistory, while very interesting, it's very interesting to think about archaeology, digging up ancient sites, digging up ancient ruins. But what happens, and this is what turned me off as a historian to archaeology, what happens is once the ruins are uncovered, once things are discovered and set on the table, it then becomes a debate as to what the things are, what the things mean, when the things were made, when they were used. And all of those discussions are mere theoretical, uncertain, and we find that this idea of the study of history through archaeology and geology does not lead us to any greater certainty, and therefore it's a waste of time. The greatest certainty that we can gain of the knowledge of human history From a secular standpoint, let's not assume Christian faith. From a secular standpoint, we'll come through the comparison of different written records to see if what man has written and testified of his history and experience, different people writing at different times, separated from one another geographically, separated by time, and writing and sharing their knowledge of history. When we see how these stories, how these accounts compare, we can draw from those testimonies what appears to be true and certain, and what is uncertain, what's disagreed upon or questionable. And we can establish a reliable human history. And as I said, that's not based on Christian faith. That's based on simple human reason, listening to different accounts and judging what appears to be certain and what's uncertain or what's impossible. When we add to that the grace of faith, and we look at history through the eyes of faith, as it were, we then can accept divine revelation as it speaks to us about human history and about the history of the world. And we can accept that on the grounds of faith as absolutely certain, because it's being revealed by God himself, who cannot lie or be deceived. And so, yes, it's true that understanding world history under the influence of faith certainly leads us to disagree with these ideas presented as quote-unquote modern thought by this historian. But even more than that, human reason itself, without faith, leads us to question whether or not this is an acceptable way of studying and learning human history with any certainty, with any, in the classical term, in the classical sense, with any scientific knowledge that's demonstrated and is absolutely certain. So it's important for us to learn this modern materialistic view of the world, so that we can understand why these worldly scholars and many Christian scholars who are caught up in their errors and just learn these things in school, don't study critically, and just repeat them for a living, why we can understand, or how we can understand not only what they teach, but why they teach it. We can challenge them to provide us with evidence for the things they say, for demonstrative evidence, not mere theory, not mere plausible explanations for how things might have happened. We'll find that they often present these ideas in that language, but then use them to disprove or reject other ideas, as if what they've established as possible is now all of a sudden demonstrated fact and certain. And we have to learn to discern when that's being done, catch men when they do that, and demand demonstrative evidence from them. Because what they're trying to do is force a rejection of the traditional knowledge of human history by using their theories as a hammer to beat people with. And they usually go unchecked because of the positions that they hold in society. If you're a 20-year-old college student seeking a good grade in a history class, and your professor teaches these ideas, you may have no option but to repeat them back without questioning them or suffer lower grades. And so these scholars take advantage of their position in society, and they often use that power that they have to just force these ideas onto people and then mark them correct when they're repeated back without any objection or question. And we can't do that. We have to have the guts as students to ask for evidence, and we have to be willing to take a stand when we find people doing that because it's very common in this modern age. It's what the scientific method, I believe, was intended to do. It was intended to take power away from those established authorities which rightly have and truly have that power, so that it could be stolen by men who have no such real power. And this, I believe, is the source of the error that's called modernism in the Catholic Church, which popes warned about in the early 1900s when this book was being written. So, I hope that's a helpful walk through this first part of Chapter 1. Obviously, we're not going to spend this much time on every part of every chapter because this study would go on forever, but I'd like to take time in these early lessons to address some of these principles which are thankfully explained by the author so that we can examine them, be aware of them, and then make good use of this history text as we go forward in our study. So I hope that's helpful. Study this section on your own. Study for mastery. Be sure to read it carefully. Don't just watch the video and accept what I say. Read the text and see clearly what the author is saying. Read every word. Take your time. Complete your lesson assessments, and we'll continue this study together through ancient history. God bless your studies.